No one will see the tears. The sky cracked open, and the taste of iron filled his mouth as the wind tore at the edges of his ripped flight jacket. Smoke stung his eyes, but there was something else, the bitter sting of regret, thicker than the burning fuel around him. The wreckage lay scattered across a silent French meadow, far too quiet for a battlefield. Yet it echoed with the absence of voices he would never hear again. Daniel Parker, first lieutenant, 26 years old but feeling 100, lay among the twisted metal. The last thing he remembered before the flames swallowed their B-17 was the voice of James, tail gunner, always grinning, always too damn loud, shouting, "Hold on, Danny." And then silence. Now he was the only one left breathing. The compass dug into his chest, the one thing he'd managed to keep when the parachute snapped open above him. James had shoved it into his hands before the mission, half smiling as he said, "You lose your way, you follow this. Always points true. Even when we don't. True." What did that even mean anymore? The horizon was already turning dusky, the clouds painted bruised purple. He forced himself up, ignoring the sharp protest from his leg, and limped toward the tree lean, where shadows lingered longer. The compass needle trembled, but he knew it wasn't pointing north, it was pointing back. Back to the burning wreck. Back to a sky that had turned its back on him. And then he saw her. A figure in the trees, half hidden by mist and fading light. A woman, shawl pulled tight around her, eyes sharp as winter frost. Not a hallucination. No, he was too awake for that kind of mercy. She didn't speak, just gestured. Follow. He didn't have the strength to ask why. The cabin was no more than rough timber, the scent of damp wood and earth pressing close. She worked in silence, binding his leg with fabric that might have once been a dress, hands gentle but swift. When she finally spoke, it was in careful English, shaped by an accent older than war itself. "You are lucky, monsieur." Lucky? His voice cracked. "You breathe." He wanted to tell her how wrong she was, but the words tangled with the memories of men who would never take another breath. As the night deepened, rain began to patter against the roof. She never asked his name, never asked why he was there. Instead, she left him with a flickering lantern and a cup of something so bitter it felt like punishment. The compass sat on the table. Its needle never wavered. Rain drummed against the roof, soft but insistent, the sound pressing into the walls of the cabin. Daniel lay still, the ache in his leg sharpening with every heartbeat. The room was quiet, yet heavy with the unspoken, like the silence after an engine fails, when nothing remains but the waiting. The woman worked in the corner, slicing bread with steady hands. Her face stayed hidden by shadows, but the light caught the glint of a silver cross at her throat, worn and tarnished. She never looked his way, yet nothing escaped her notice. The compass remained on the table where he'd left it, the needle as steady as the pulse behind his eyes. His mind wandered back to the mission briefing, the stale scent of coffee in the ready room. The map spread like accusations across the table. Target, a rail junction near Le Mans. Critical for German supply lines. Simple, they said. High altitude. Minimum risk. Nothing had been simple. The flak had come early, black blossoms tearing through the clouds. One engine gone, then another. The plane bucked hard, smoke filling the cockpit, James shouting something, but the words were lost beneath the roar. And then the ground was rushing up. Too fast, too final. The compass had been in his pocket even then. James's gift, a joke at first, a relic from some pawn shop in Boston. "You'll need this when you get turned around out there," he'd said. Now it was all Daniel had left of the man. The woman glanced toward him, her eyes lingering a moment longer than before. She set the bread down, then crossed the room, offering a small tin cup. Water. No words, just the quiet insistence of care. Outside, the rain had softened. Somewhere beyond the trees, the world was still tearing itself apart. Gunfire in the distance, distant echoes of things he could not see but felt deep in the marrow. Time passed strangely here. The fever came in waves, blurring moments. Once, he woke to find a second figure in the cabin. A man older with the same frostbitten eyes. They spoke softly, too quiet for Daniel to catch more than fragments. Aviator, danger, Germans close. By the third day, he could sit up. The woman brought soup, thin but warm. No questions. No names. The compass remained untouched, its silent vigil on the table. Then came the sound of boots on wet earth. Not hers. Not the old man. A different rhythm, sharp, measured. Soldiers. The woman moved first, a flash of dark cloth as she doused the lantern. Silence, deeper now, pressing hard against the thin walls. The boots stopped outside the door. Long enough for a knock, 3, slow, deliberate. The door never opened. The soldiers left, but the war never felt closer. The hours stretched long after the soldiers left, the kind where every breath seemed louder than it should be. Rain had stopped, but the dampness lingered, pressing into the cabin's walls, into Daniel's skin. He remained still, listening, waiting, though for what, he couldn't say. The woman's face had tightened in the lantern's faint return, shadows etching lines of quiet resolve. She didn't look at him, but at the door, the way someone watches a wound to see if it will break open. Night sank deeper. The fever had lessened, but his leg throbbed as though the pain had settled in his bones. He traced the edge of the compass with his fingers, the metal worn smooth from years of touch. James had held it just the same. The ache behind his ribs was worse than the wound. She returned near dawn, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth, bread, cheese, and a folded map so worn it looked older than the war itself. She set it on the table beside the compass. No words passed between them. The map spoke for her. A river snaked west, marked with a smear of charcoal. Beyond it, names of villages, blurred and uncertain, and a single word underlined, safe. She pointed to his chest, the compass still pressed there. A silent message, but safety was a lie. He had learned that over the Ardennes, over Saint Nazaire, over every patch of sky where metal turned men to shadows. Still, he nodded. The old man returned that evening. He was thinner than Daniel remembered, face tight with a quiet defiance. From his coat, he produced a length of cloth, pale and unassuming, a civilian scarf, disguise of swords. The cabin was never meant to be a sanctuary, only a pause. Daniel slept lightly, waking often. Once, in the middle of the night, he saw the woman staring at the compass in the lantern's glow. Her face unreadable. Not curiosity, something deeper. By the fourth morning, the fever had nearly passed. The old man pressed the map into his hands with a look that seemed more final than it should have. Daniel left the cabin before sunrise, the scarf wound tight around his neck, the compass tucked beneath his shirt. The river was half a day's walk north, the old man had said. Cross before dusk. Do not look back. The forest pressed close as he moved, damp leaves brushing his face, each sound magnified. He counted steps, watched the compass needle shift. But the war was never far. Distant engines, voices, low but clear, the harsh scrape of German words. Close. Too close. He pressed himself into the undergrowth, the compass tight in his fist. For the first time, the needle seemed to waver. The compass trembled in his palm, the needle wavering, just a fraction, but enough to twist something cold in his gut. Breath held, he listened. Boots on wet leaves, voices closer now. A pause. Then, the unmistakable click of a rifle's safety being released. Daniel knew the sound, knew the weight of it from the inside. A branch snapped. The forest seemed to fold inward. He pressed lower, the damp earth seeping into his skin. One breath. Two. A third. Then the boots moved on, fading east. The Germans were searching, but not for him. Not yet. He waited, heart thundering loud enough to drown out the river's faint rush ahead. Only when silence returned did he rise, leg protesting every step. The compass remained tight in his fist, the needle true again, steady as the pulse behind his eyes. The river came into view by dusk, swollen from days of rain, its current sluggish but wide. A wooden boat rocked gently near the shore, more as though expecting him. A flash of pale cloth tied at the stern, the same fabric as the scarf wound around his neck. The woman had been here. Climbing in, he let the current take him. The water whispered beneath the hull, the only sound but for his own ragged breathing. He remembered James once after a mission, whispering a line from some book he could never place. You cross a river, you're never the same man twice. But James was gone. The sky had taken him. The far bank loomed close, muddy, empty, almost a figure. Not German, civilian. Cloak drawn tight, face obscured, waiting. Daniel stumbled from the boat, the compass warm in his palm, an anchor to the past. The figure approached, holding something wrapped in dark cloth, a whisper of recognition. The old man from the cabin, but his face strained, as though the weight of silence had finally broken him. No words passed between them. The old man pressed the cloth into Daniel's hands. Heavy, a pistol. Daniel shook his head. This was not why he had survived, not why James had. But the old man turned, already disappearing into the mist. The compass trembled again. Not north, west. The war was calling him back. The river faded behind him. Ahead, only shadows, only silence, and somewhere a mission unfinished.